Well, what a good morning it is to come in the house of the Lord and to worship Him. And this week I was really struggling with some of the things in my own life, some things that I'm trying to get answers from God on, and really asking God to come through and to reveal what He wants to do in my life and in my family's life and in just different areas. And many of you have probably been there where you've asked God, I just need to hear from you in this moment, in this time. What do you want us to do as a family? What do you want me to do in my own life? Where are you leading me? Where are you leading us as a church? I was praying about God's vision for the church and where we're headed and what God wants to speak to us corporately. And it really began to feel like I was wrestling with God. Have you ever been there where you feel like you just enter into this wrestling match and you're just going, God, I need answers from you, but the more you ask for answers, the more that you begin to wrestle back and forth and really say, God, I just need to hear from you. And as I was doing this, I thought, God, I wonder if this is okay. You ever ask those questions? Lord, I wonder if this wrestling is okay, if this wrestling with you is okay. Are we supposed to wrestle with God, or is God just supposed to give us the answers and then we just follow Him and we avoid all of that wrestling? And so I kept going back and forth with God, saying, God, I don't know. Am I supposed to be wrestling with you, or am I supposed to be hearing something different? Am I trying my own ways and not listening to you? Is that why I'm wrestling so much? And God led me to Genesis chapter 32, which is the story of Jacob really wrestling with God in this deal. And so I want to examine that this morning and really look at what it means to wrestle with God and really ask the question, is it okay to wrestle with God? And so our whole focus this morning is going to be trying to unpack that story and really look at, is it okay at times in our lives to wrestle with God? And what does that look like and what does that mean? But in order to understand this story, we've got to start way back at the beginning of the story, the beginning of Jacob's life. It takes place in Genesis chapter 25, verse 21. And what we see here is that Rebekah and Isaac have come together in marriage. They've come together and started a life together, but Rebekah has no children. Isaac is concerned about his wife, Rebekah. He wants her to have children. And I've talked to many couples who have struggled with wanting to have children, wanting to have a family, and it hasn't happened at that moment. And so some can relate to this story really, really well. And Isaac begins to cry out on behalf of his wife that God would deliver to her children, that He would make her fruitful and really bring life into the world. And so I want to pick up in Genesis chapter 25, verse 21, and I want to read here what it says. It says, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them, and the boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And so it's an interesting story as this plays out because Isaac cries out for his wife. Now, those of you mothers that are out there, how many of you know that when you're praying for children, most of you aren't praying for twins? And I did this all throughout. Before Sheila had kids, I kept saying, God, I want twins. Lord, give me twins. And Sheila said that God will not give you more than you can handle. And he was talking about the wife, not the husband. And so God never honored my prayer. He blessed my wife and gave her what she could handle. And I am thankful now having children that God didn't honor my prayer because I've seen those who have raised twins and how much work it can be. But Isaac is crying out and he's asking God to deliver this baby. Not only does God give him the request that he's asking for, but God multiplies his request and he gives him twin boys. But God begins to speak to Rebekah early on in this pregnancy, and he says to her that there's going to be two nations and they're going to be rival nations. God begins to talk about the fight that's going to take place between these brothers and the division that's going to happen, and he begins to talk about how Esau would be stronger than Jacob, and yet he would serve Jacob. Now, how many of you parents, if you got a word like this, would go, wow, that sounds like a great word? You ever think about what Rebecca's receiving here? She's got this word from God. She knows that she's pregnant with twins. She knows that God's raising up two nations within inside of her. But then God also tells her about the conflict that's going to take place. Now, I know as a parent, my number one desire is that my children love each other and that they love us as their parents. And God begins to already talk about this war that's going to happen, this conflict that's going to happen. Not only does he talk about it, but when Esau is delivered, Jacob is already fighting to be first. Because he comes out grasping the heel of Esau. There's already this war that's beginning, even with inside the womb, where he's trying to receive something that's not yet his. So from the very first day that Jacob is born, Jacob is trying to get power. He's trying to get authority. He's trying to be first. He's trying to get what belongs to him. And so when we go further into the story where we see that Rebekah decides that they're going to create this lie for Jacob and get the birthright that belongs to Esau. And so she clothes him with hair and sends him into his father so he receives the birthright. This didn't start just because Rebekah decided she had a plan. This started right from the very point of conception. There was this rivalry, this war that was going on between these two brothers. Jacob has always been trying to grab onto something that was not his to get. See, God promised that Esau would serve Jacob, but Jacob's trying to make it happen in his own way. How many of us have ever had a promise from God where God promises to do something for us, but then we try to come in and make it happen? You ever get like that in your life? You say, God, you promised that I would be able to do this, or you promised that we would be able to be victorious in your name. God, you promised that we would be able to advance your kingdom. And so we hold on to the promises of God, but instead of waiting on God to bring deliverance in our lives, how many of us sometimes run out and try and make it happen on our own? You ever been there? And we're struggling with life, and we're struggling with the world, and we're struggling to understand God because instead of waiting upon God to deliver us, we're out there fighting for it on our own. And so this is Jacob's MO from the very beginning from his birth until this point. He's been fighting to get what's rightfully his. He's been fighting to get the promises of God that God promised to give him, but he's been trying to do it all in his own strength. You see, when Rebekah came to Jacob, he could have said, that's not how we do this. Jacob was old enough that he could have looked at his mother and said, Mom, that's not my birthright. But he was willing to go along with what Rebekah said because he was so hungry to be first. He was so desperate to get what God had promised. And I'm sure Rebekah had said to him, God said that Esau would serve you. See, she had heard God, and we even see the divide. It says that Rebekah loved Jacob, but Isaac loved Esau. Even within their marriage, there's this divide that's going on where they pick favorites. Parents, can I tell you, it's really dangerous to have favorites in our families. There are times where we relate to one child or the other easier. Maybe our personalities get along with them easier. And there's times where I see this all the time where parents have a child that they relate to easier and the other parent may relate to another one. But how many know that always causes conflict in a family? And so this conflict is going on, and Jacob, he steals the birthright and he runs off to his uncle Laban's house in Haran, and he has to get away because Esau is threatening to kill him. And for those of you that have older siblings, how many know if you stole something that was theirs, they'd probably want to kill you too? They may not physically kill you, but there's going to be a fight in the household, right? How many of you have ever taken something that belonged to your brother or sister and had to pay the price for it when they found out you had what was theirs? I see it all the time in my kids, and I still have yet to this day to understand how they know exactly what belongs to them. We have so many toys in our house, but there are specific toys that they are theirs. Nobody else can touch that. That is my toy. And any one of their siblings touches that toy, the fight is on, the war is on. And so now we're talking about grown men who this birthright was everything to them. To receive the birthright meant you passed on the family name. You got the blessing of God. The blessings of God went with that firstborn son, and he was going to increase in wealth. He was going to increase in power. He was going to increase in authority, and he would lead that family when the patriarch passed on. And so what Jacob has taken from Esau is everything. It wasn't just a simple blessing. It wasn't just a simple prayer. He took everything from him. His whole existence was taken away from him because now as the firstborn, he no longer had a blessing because it had been given to his brother. And so these feelings arise, and Esau, furious at Jacob, runs him out of the land. Jacob takes off for fear of his life, and he heads to Laban, and while there, we know the story well, he develops interest in a young lady named Rachel, and he goes to Laban, and he wants to marry Rachel, and Laban says, work for me 7 years, and I will give you my daughter. And so Jacob, again, instead of consulting God, instead of dealing with what God may want, instead of asking God if this was an appropriate marriage, instead of asking God how he should go about this, what does he do? He sets out to earn something all by himself. Now, you would think he learned the first time he had to leave his land and run away that maybe he should involve God. How many of you know some of us have run a lot and we still have problems consulting God sometimes? You ever been there? We keep running from God, from situation to situation. We get ourselves into trouble. We run on to the next situation. And in times when we should stop and ask God what he thinks about it or what he wants us to do, we just keep blazing ahead, trying to make a name for ourselves, trying to create something. And that's exactly what Jacob does here. He blazes ahead. He works 7 years for Laban. And guess what? He does not receive what he set out to receive. How many know sometimes our efforts are fruitless? Doesn't matter how hard we work. Sometimes we can work as hard as we want, but if God's not in it, how many know sometimes we don't get what we set out to achieve because we never asked God to be a part of it? So he wakes up one morning and he's married to the wrong woman. How many of you think you'd be a little frustrated? How many of you think Jacob was a little frustrated when he rolled over and there was Leah and not Rachel? Hello. He goes out to Laban and they have this discussion, and Laban says, well, give me 7 more years, and then I'll finally give you Rachel. Once again, Jacob never consults God. He never talks with God. He never asks God, what he should do in this situation. He just does it all on his own. This is a man who is so determined to get what he wants that no matter what it takes, he's going to get it done. Some of us men, we can blaze ahead, and we can work really, really hard, and we can be really, really bullheaded sometimes, and that's exactly what Jacob was doing. He was convinced that if he would just work hard enough, he could get everything he wanted. And so he sets out for another 7 years and he works hard and he finally gets Rachel. He finally gets the woman of his dreams. Now, not only does he have the woman of his dreams, but he's married to her sister as well. How many think that caused a little conflict? Ladies, I know you studied this a few weeks back and looked at the conflict between these sisters. And so now he's not only married to the woman of his dreams, he's married to her sister as well. But now more problems arise because Laban's sons begin to see that God is blessing Jacob. How many know that God always honors his blessings even if we do things wrong? Have you ever thought about that? Sometimes I think about that and I think, God, I don't know why you are as good as you are. I'm grateful that he is. But God always honors his promises to us even when we make a mess of things. Jacob makes a total mess of things, and yet God said that he would make him into a nation, that his brother would serve him, that he would bless him, and he's also received the blessing from his father, the birthright blessing, which now is on his life as well. And so God's blessing begins to come forth in Jacob's life, and he begins to grow in wealth and in stature. And Laban's sons look on and say, this is not right. He's taken everything our dad owns. The truth of the matter is, every time Laban tried to cheat Jacob out of something, God honored Jacob in every deal he ever made with Laban. How many know the world can't cheat us out of what God promises? Amen? Laban tried. If you read this story, and I would encourage you to go through and read this story this week, if you read this whole story from beginning to end, Laban tried to cheat Jacob a lot. And every time Laban would say, you can have the spotted ones, and Jacob would say, okay, God would bring all the spotted lambs and give them to Jacob. And they would increase in number. Every time Laban would change his mind, God would bless the new decision on Jacob's life, and Jacob would increase. And so now Laban's sons look on, and they basically see Jacob as this scoundrel. Jacob sees what's going on, and so he decides that it's not safe for him there anymore. How many of you know that when we do things our own way, things get really rough really, really quick? Even though the blessings of God still honors his blessings, we still have to pay the consequences for our actions. And Jacob's been running from God. He's been running from his family. He's been running from all kinds of things his whole life. And so he finds himself in another place of running, and he sets out to try to run home. But at this point, he doesn't know if he can even go home because he doesn't know if Esau has even forgiven him, but he figures it's better than where he's at with Laban. So he gathers up his wives and they take off to head back towards Esau, and Laban sets out to come and to kill him from behind, and Esau sets out from his land to come and to kill Jacob from in front of him. And so Jacob is stuck between two people that hate his very existence. How many of you think Jacob's got a good life at this point? So he's running back to his homeland, and he's pursued by an enemy behind him, and his family who doesn't like him any more than his brother that doesn't like him any more than his uncle behind him, who's coming out to him. And Jacob begins to believe that his life is over. You ever been there? You ever been at a spot where no matter what you did, everything seemed to turn out wrong, and you start to realize that you haven't really consulted God? You start to realize that even though you've believed in God, you may not have been out involving God in your whole life, and so you find yourself in this predicament where you're not sure where to go from here. Because it seems like there's just enemies all around you. It seems like everybody's out to get you. It seems like your life is about to be destroyed. And Jacob, he's struggling with this. And I want you to see what happens in Genesis chapter 32. If you have your Bibles, I want you to go there with me. Right before this happens, Laban catches up to Jacob. And God shows up to Laban in a dream, and God says to Laban, you are not allowed to speak to Jacob. You're not allowed to lay a hand on him. He's protected. And so Jacob and Laban have an exchange, and Laban realizes that there's nothing he's going to do to Jacob, and God delivers Jacob's life. And it brings us right to this chapter, and it says this. Then Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, this is the camp of God. So he named that place Menahem. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He instructed them, this is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys and sheep and goats and male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my lord that I may find favor in your eyes. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, we went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and the herds and the camels as well. And he thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. Do you see the fear that's in Jacob at this point? What's interesting to me is that the angels of the Lord come to Jacob and they reveal that God is with Jacob, that God is coming to meet him, that God is there with him. And yet Jacob doesn't even pause for a moment to really consider what that means. It says that he names the place, this is the camp of God. He recognizes the presence of God, and yet he does not stop to seek the Lord at this point. Instead, he begins to put together plans of how to approach Esau and try and deliver himself from the hand of Esau. And how does he do it? He does it by telling him all the wealth he has, trying to win Esau over and buy his favor. Can I tell you that sometimes when we grow in wealth and power and favor, sometimes we begin to think that we're our own deliverer? Because we begin to think that we have all we could ever want. And Jacob, he really doesn't realize that God is the only thing that's going to deliver him here in this phase of his life. And so he sends these men to Esau, and they report back to him that Esau's coming with 400 men. Now, it never says at this point what Esau's heart is in the story. Many people have speculated on what is going on. Most people believe that Esau is coming to attack Jacob. Most people believe that Esau still has the anger that he had when Jacob left years ago, and that he is bringing 400 men to wipe him out. There's a reason that they come back and they report all the number of men that are with Esau. Now, whether or not they didn't see God and the servants didn't see God, all they saw was the men, there's a lot of speculation on how that could have happened. But I really believe that Esau is coming to confront Jacob, and he's not coming to confront him with brotherly love. He's bringing these men out, and they've seen the army that's coming, and Jacob gets terrified. Can I tell you something? Fear always cripples us from being able to see who God is. Fear always cripples us from being able to see who God is. Jacob begins to divide everybody up, and his plan is this: I'll put some people in front of me and my family, and if Esau wipes them out, hopefully the rest of us can run away. What a nice guy. How many of you been in that first group that Jacob said, you stand in front of us over here, and we'll just stay back here and see what happens? That's what's going on here. And then all of a sudden in verse 9, we see a change of heart in Jacob. Look what finally happens in Jacob. This is what it says. It says, then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. So he spent the night there, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau, and it goes on to talk about what that gift was. Does this sound like a prayer of someone who's confident in what God has promised, or a prayer of someone who's trying to believe what God has promised? He's trying to believe this. He finally begins to think about what God has said to him. He finally begins to think about the promises of God on his life. He finally begins to think about the fact that God is with him. I'm sure he remembers the angels showing up in camp. He begins to have all this brought back to him, and so he begins to pray. But this isn't a prayer of a confident man at this point who's saying, God, I believe your promises. This is a prayer of a man who's saying, God, my brother's going to kill me, but you've promised this. I know you've promised this. I don't know if you're going to do it. I don't know how you're going to do it. Lord, I don't even know if this is going to be true, but this is what you said to me, so you have to come through for me. How many of us have ever prayed like that? God, you promised. How many of you parents ever heard your kids, when you've promised them something and they haven't yet seen it, how many of them have come to you and said, but you promised? You ever have that conversation with your children? The other day I came home and I told Matthew I'd play a game with him, and I said, well, not now. I want to go and do something else, but when I get back, I'll do this. And he said, but Dad, you promised. How do you say no to that as a father? That's the discussion that Jacob's having with God, his Father in heaven. He's saying, God, but you promised me. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know where you're at. I don't know why Esau's coming to kill me, but you promised me if I would follow you, you would do this for me. He's clinging to the fact that God as a father is going to hear his cry, and he's going to give in to what he's pleading because God made a promise with him. He still goes to trying to do it his own way. He still begins to figure out what he can send to Esau. Again, he has this long prayer with God, and then he instantly comes out of that time and says, okay, what am I going to send to Esau to win his favor? So he's saying, God, you're my deliverer, and then he comes out and he says, but if you don't come through, maybe this will work. You see how we wrestle with God in these situations sometimes? God, I know your word says this. I know you promised to never leave us nor forsake us. God, I know that you promised that if we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we'll fear no evil. But just in case you aren't there, I want to make sure I have a safety net. And so there's this wrestling that's going on with Jacob, whether he's going to believe God or whether he's going to continue to try and do it his own way. And he keeps going back and forth between the promises of God and his own deliverance. And then in verse 22, he's sent these gifts to Esau. He knows that tomorrow is going to be the day, and So it says in Genesis 32, verse 22, that night Jacob got up. He took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jacob. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask me my name?" And then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. And therefore to this day the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So Jacob goes into this night still wrestling with God. He's still wrestling with whether he's going to believe God and trust God. And he gets to the place where he sends everybody else across the stream, and he's left completely alone. How many of you know that sometimes we need to be alone? We need the body of Christ. We need each other. We need to be a family. But there are times that God calls us to get alone with him. And there are times when we're struggling with things that we need to get alone with God and really wrestle through what God's saying to us. And sometimes that can't happen in a group, and that can't happen with everybody else around us. And I love corporate worship, and I love the times that we have together. But can I tell you something? If we're not spending time alone with God, wrestling over some of these issues with God, some of the struggles that we're having with God, when we come together in corporate worship, we will never receive all that God has for us, because it starts in our quiet times with God. It starts alone with God. It starts with seeking the face of God. And so Jacob sends his family on ahead of him because he needs to get real with himself. He needs to get real with some of the issues that he's been dealing with for years and years and years. There's things he's been covering up. There's things he's been hiding. There's weaknesses that he has that he doesn't want anybody else to see. And so he sends them on ahead of him, and he stays there in that place to try and deal with some things that night. And it says that while he's there, a man comes to him, and he begins to wrestle with this man. Now, many people have speculated this is an angel. I'm just going to tell you that it never says who this man was. It just says that a man comes and begins to wrestle with Jacob. Jacob says that he saw the face of God. He calls the place Peniel, which means that he saw the face of God. So was it an angel? Very possibly. Was it a form of God coming in the form of man to wrestle with Jacob? That's a possibility as well. But in any way, shape, or form, God sends some angelic being to wrestle with Jacob that night. He brings the wrestling to Jacob. The word wrestle in the Hebrew simply means to roll around in the dust, to get dirty, rolling and tossing and wrestling. And so he wrestles all night long, and he rolls around in the dust with this man, and it says that the man knows that he's not going to win. How many of us have ever wrestled with God and felt like we were going to come out victorious? Most of us feel like we couldn't make it another hour. Jacob is so desperate for God at this point that he's willing to hold on for dear life. He's got nothing left. I don't even know that Jacob recognizes who this is that he's wrestling with. I think that Jacob had so much fear that his brother was coming that he sees this man and he engages him without ever even thinking twice about it. And he begins to roll around and to wrestle with this man, and partway through the night, Jacob begins to realize that there's something different about this man. And finally, come daybreak, the man says to Jacob, "Let me go." And Jacob says to him, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." How many of us have that kind of boldness when we come into prayer with God? You ever think about that? Think about the statement that Jacob is making to God at this point. God, I've tried to do this my own way. God, I've tried to do this my whole life. God, I've tried to achieve the blessings my own way, in my own strength, in this human way. But God, I am not letting go until I receive the blessing you have promised. I'm holding on to you because, God, everything I've done has failed. That's what Jacob's saying to this man in the middle of the night. He's saying, everything else I've done has failed. This is my last effort. There's nothing else I can do. If God doesn't come through in my life, I am done. And so he holds on for dear life and he says, I won't let go until you bless me. How many of you know that when the man, whether an angel or whether God himself or an angelic being, when he blesses Jacob, how many know Jacob was overwhelmed? Not only is he exhausted from the wrestling, but he's overwhelmed that he's finally received what he came to want to receive his whole life. The man says to Jacob, you've not only wrestled with God, but you've wrestled with man. Why? Because his whole life he's been wrestling with man. His whole life he's been wrestling with trying to achieve something for himself, but now he's finally realized that his battle's not against flesh and blood, and he's finally realized that he needed to receive from God what God wanted for his life. And so now he takes this wrestling that he's been doing his whole life and he engages with God and he says, God, I need you to come through in my life. Now, there's a big difference with wrestling with God and wrestling against God. Do you notice that in this chapter, it never says that Jacob came and he wrestled against God. It says that Jacob wrestled with God. You see, Jacob didn't go looking for a fight with God. Jacob didn't go to God saying, God, I don't believe you. God, I'm going to prove you wrong. God, I'm going to show you that you don't know what you're talking about. That was never Jacob's heart. Jacob's heart was never to come against God and to stand against God. Jacob's heart was that he really wanted the blessings that had been promised to him. He just didn't know how to get it. And so when God finally comes to Jacob, he engages with God and he's willing to go through this process of wrestling to receive from God what God has promised. See, God brought the match to Jacob. Jacob didn't go looking for a fight with God. How many of us know that there are times that God brings difficult situations in our life so that we will wrestle through them and find Him in the midst of those circumstances? You ever been there? I believe that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and I believe that we blame God for a lot of the things that the enemy is doing, but I also believe there are times where God brings us into difficult situations and difficult circumstances because He's wanting to know if we will wrestle with Him to see His hand in the midst of difficulty. And many times we either wrestle with the circumstance or we wrestle against God rather than wrestling with God. Do you ever think about that? It's a big difference between wrestling with God and wrestling against God. There's a Christian author by the name of Winfrey Brisley, and I was reading an article by her on this very subject this week, and I just want to read to you just a couple sentences that she says on this, and I really agree with what she's saying. She says, sometimes we wrestle with the Lord as Jacob did, and I say, I will not let go unless you bless me. We persist in pursuing the Lord and don't give up until He has given us wisdom or peace or contentment or victory over sin we seek. We grow in relationship with the Lord when we bring Him our questions, our doubts, and fears, and we wrestle with Him. Most likely we'll not physically wrestle with the Lord as Jacob did, so what does our wrestling look like? We wrestle with Him through prayer, talking to Him about questions and concerns. We wrestle with Him in His Word, searching its pages for truth that speaks to our situation, meditating on relevant passages, and memorizing verses that encourage or convict us. We wrestle with Him through the wise counsel of others. As we hear the preached word, we read books and articles and have intentional conversations. The Spirit speaks through godly people, giving us truth and instruction to process and apply. And I thought as I read that, what an awesome picture for us today of what it means to wrestle with God. It's not that we come to try and prove God wrong. It's not that we come to try and question God, but it's that we come through prayer, we come through study, we come through just getting alone with God and saying, God, I need to know who you are. And sometimes I think we're so afraid to ask those hard questions because we want to be faithful. We don't want to doubt. We don't want to have any kind of confusion in our lives. And so we sometimes don't do the wrestling that we need to do with God to understand who God really is in our lives. And one of the things that I used to do all the time is I would take what I had heard and I would say, well, this has to be the way it is. And so if I question this, then I'm in the wrong. And so I would take that, and when challenged upon it, had no basis to be able to defend that. And I would come away completely and absolutely frustrated because I believed it to be true and yet had no foundation on which to stand. And the more that I've looked at that, I believe God wants us to go to His Word and to really wrestle with some of those passages in His Word. There are things in the Scriptures that I'm still wrestling with to understand, God, where are you in this? What are you saying to us as a church? What are you saying to me personally? What are you saying to me as a family? And we take that passage of Scripture and we say, I may not understand it, but God, help me to wrestle with you through this passage until you reveal what you have in it for me. How many know if we would engage with God in that way, He would bring amazing breakthrough in our lives? There are times in prayer where I say, God, I'm not giving up, and I'm going to continue to wrestle with you through this circumstance in my life. And God, help me to never give up. Help me never quit praying until I see your hand deliver this situation in my life. And here's the deal. Sometimes we walk away from those situations with a limp. You see, nobody likes to focus on that part of this story with Jacob. Jacob's greatest fear in meeting Esau is that Esau was going to destroy him. And so God weakens Jacob so that he will have to trust God to deliver him as he goes to meet Esau. He goes to encounter Esau the next morning, not a whole man, but a man with a limp. If he was afraid before, he had every opportunity to be even more terrified now because he couldn't run as fast as he did the day before. Jacob's greatest problem his whole life was that every time something came into his life, he ran away from the problem instead of seeking the heart of God. And so God causes him to not be able to run any longer. See, sometimes we come into that wrestling with God, and sometimes we've got a lot of arrogance and pride in our own lives, and so sometimes God has to do a little humbling so that we can see who He is and step out of the way. It's not always bad to come out of those situations with a limp, because sometimes when we come out of that situation with a limp, we look to God and say, God, now I really can't do this. So God, help me to depend on you. The amazing thing is that Jacob doesn't just walk out of that situation for a day or 2 days. It says that from that point on, he always walked with a limp. He received the blessings of God. God gave him everything he had ever wanted, but he had a constant reminder in his life of who God was. Because from that point forward, every time he took a step, he remembered his encounter with God. See, it's not because God's mean or vindictive. He wasn't trying to just be harsh to Jacob, but he wanted to prove that he was God and that Jacob needed to trust him. So he gives him this constant reminder that from this day forward, you have to look upon me to carry you through. See, I don't know what you're going through this morning. I don't know where your life's at. I know that there's areas of my life that this really hit home for this week. I know that there's things in my life that I need to press into God and to really wrestle with God and allow God to deliver His answers in my life and to really speak to me as a father, as a husband, as a pastor. You know, I need to see God come through in a lot of ways so we know where we're going and what we're to do. And I don't know, you may be in a job that God's calling you to stick it out, and you're feeling frustrated and upset and not sure how to get through, and you just need to wrestle with God through those moments and say, God, help me to be a witness even in the midst of the stuff that I don't understand right now. God may be transitioning you from one place into the next place in your life, and you're saying, God, I don't want to be transitioned, and you need to engage with God and wrestle with God in this circumstance and say, God, what are you doing? Why are you saying this? How do I trust you in this circumstance? You may be a parent this morning that's saying, God, I don't even know what to do with my kids anymore. And God's calling you to engage with Him, to wrestle with Him, and to see His truths revealed through the Word of God of what it means to be a godly parent so you can stick it out and come through. I don't know the circumstance that you're in, but I do know this. If we are willing to engage with God, not against God, and to wrestle with God through prayer and through study and through really hearing His heart, I promise you that God will always come through if we're willing to never give up. Maybe for some of us, that wrestling is asking God to help us to keep pressing in. Maybe some of us are exhausted and tired, and we've been in this battle for a long time. We're saying, God, I just need to hear you, and I don't know where that's at. Maybe we need God to come through in our lives and give us the determination to press in. And so before we partake of the Lord's Supper together, I just want us to take a few minutes and just to get alone with the Lord and to ask God what He's saying to you this morning. And I'm going to even open up the altar this morning, and if you just need to get alone with the Lord for a minute and get on your knees before the Lord, I invite you to do that. Whatever it means, I just want you to get with God this morning and hear His heart. So would you just take a few moments and engage with the Lord? Lord, I'll be the first one to confess that sometimes I've not always wrestled with you, but Lord, I've wrestled against you. So Lord, this morning, if we've been wrestling against you, Lord, I just ask that you would forgive us. Lord, help us to see what it means to wrestle with you. Lord, help us to see what it means to cry out for you to deliver us. Father, help us to trust you. Lord, I pray that we would come out of those times with you different than we went in. Lord, whatever may be going on in our lives this morning, Lord, I ask that you would reveal your heart to us. Lord, would you speak your ways? Give us a hunger